In the quiet suburban town of Willoughby Hills, Ohio, the Cannell family seemed like any other. Lisa and Kevin had a peaceful life with their 3 children, Megan, Haley, and their foster daughter Sabrina. Lisa worked as a social worker, helping children who faced difficult lives, while Kevin spent his days as a truck driver. The family's home was filled with the laughter of the children, and everything seemed perfect, until one fateful night when their lives were forever altered. It was November 12th, 2012, just after midnight, when the Cannell home became a place of terror. Kevin had left for a work trip, leaving Lisa at home with the kids. Lisa had just tucked little Haley into bed and was preparing for the night when things began to spiral. Megan, at 13 years old, went to her room to sleep. Sabrina, 18 years old, was working on a school project in her room. At first, everything seemed like a typical night in the Cannell house, but something was about to happen that no one could have ever imagined. Megan had just started to doze off when she heard strange sounds coming from her mother's bedroom. At first, it sounded like muffled voices, but then the noises grew louder. There were sounds of struggle, followed by frantic thuds, as though furniture was being knocked over. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Something wasn't right. Without a second thought, Megan rushed out of her room, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran down the hallway and threw open the door to her mother's room. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. Sabrina stood there, holding a knife, blood splattered across her clothes. Lisa, lying on the bed, was motionless, her body covered in blood. Megan froze, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Sabrina was sobbing uncontrollably, but she made no effort to explain. The knife in her hand was still dripping with blood. Megan, terrified, did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice shaking as she tried to explain the horror unfolding in front of her. "Someone's stabbing my mom!" she screamed into the phone. The 911 operator on the other end tried to calm her down, but Megan's panic was evident. Minutes later, the police arrived. They rushed into the house and found Lisa's lifeless body stabbed 178 times. The brutality of the attack left them stunned. Lisa had fought back, her hands covered in defensive wounds, but it was clear Sabrina had overpowered her. Sabrina was arrested at the scene, still in shock, unable to explain what had driven her to such violence. As the police took Sabrina away in handcuffs, the investigation into the brutal murder began. The small town was shaken, and neighbors couldn't believe what they had just heard. How could a young girl, who had been living with a family who tried to give her a second chance, commit such an unforgivable act? The question on everyone's mind was simple. Why? To understand why Sabrina would turn on Lisa, we need to go back to Sabrina's past. Sabrina's childhood had been far from ordinary. Born to parents Mark Zunick and Susan Edwards, Sabrina's early life was marked by instability, neglect, and violence. Mark, a chronic alcoholic, had a history of domestic abuse. He was frequently arrested for things like assault, and his violent tendencies were no secret. Susan, Sabrina's mother, was equally troubled. A convicted drug trafficker with a history of grand theft, Susan had little time or interest in caring for her daughter. From a young age, Sabrina was exposed to abuse and neglect. By the time she was 14, she had been placed in a group home after a series of failed foster placements. She was often described as troubled, angry, and defiant. At the group home, Sabrina had a reputation for being tough, always fighting back whenever she felt threatened. It was clear she was a girl who had been broken by her past, her trust in people shattered by years of instability. Sabrina's time in the group home wasn't easy. She frequently clashed with the staff and other children. But there was something about her that caught the attention of Lisa and Kevin Cannell. Both of them worked in social services, and they believed they could help Sabrina turn her life around. They had taken in other children before and were no strangers to troubled youths. They decided to open their home to Sabrina when she was 16, offering her a fresh start. At first, things went well. Sabrina kept to herself, focusing on school and trying to stay out of trouble. She seemed to have found a sense of stability with the Cannell family. Lisa and Kevin were hopeful that Sabrina would thrive in their care. She had her own room, her own space, and was treated like one of their own children. Megan and Haley, Lisa's biological daughters, initially accepted Sabrina into their lives without question. The house was full of laughter once more, but as time passed, the cracks began to show. Sabrina's old wounds, buried deep inside her, started to resurface. The sense of alienation that she had always carried with her started to grow. She had always been the outsider, the girl who never quite fit in. In a family where everything seemed so perfect, Sabrina couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. She began to resent Lisa for what she saw as favoritism. She felt like Lisa treated her biological children, Megan and Haley, with more love and care, leaving her feeling invisible. The resentment slowly grew inside Sabrina, feeding her anger and frustration. The family dynamic began to change, and the tension between Sabrina and Lisa escalated. Sabrina would often snap at Lisa for minor things, complaining that she wasn't treated fairly. Lisa, ever the mediator, tried to reason with her, but Sabrina was beyond listening. She had been hurt too many times, and the walls she had built around herself were stronger than ever. It wasn't just her strained relationship with Lisa that was bothering Sabrina. Her bond with Kevin, her foster father, had become complicated. As Sabrina spent more time with Kevin, she began to see him not just as a father figure, but as something more. Kevin had always been there for her when she needed someone, listening to her vent about her frustrations. But somewhere along the way, Sabrina began to confuse this attention for something else. She believed Kevin was in love with her, that their bond was special, beyond just the typical father-daughter relationship. Kevin, meanwhile, never noticed the shift in Sabrina's feelings. He had been a father figure to her, offering her advice and guidance, trying to give her the stability she had never known. But Sabrina's distorted perception led her to believe that their relationship was more than just familial. She began to fantasize about a romantic connection with him, a fantasy that would ultimately lead to disastrous consequences. Lisa, on the other hand, remained unaware of Sabrina's growing discontent. She tried to help Sabrina whenever she could, but no matter how hard she tried, Sabrina's resentment continued to fester. It was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode, and no one knew when that explosion would happen. And then, that fateful night arrived. Sabrina had been feeling restless for days, and the night of November 12th, her frustration reached its peak. She had taken some painkillers, trying to ease a headache, but instead of helping, they only made her more agitated. Alone in the house, Sabrina's anger began to simmer, and she found herself thinking about everything that had gone wrong in her life. She was tired of feeling like an outsider. She was tired of being the one who had never been truly loved. It was then that Sabrina found the knife. The sharp blade gleamed in the dim light of the hallway, and in that moment, something inside her snapped. She walked into Lisa's bedroom, where her foster mother lay sleeping, and with no warning, she attacked. The first blow came quickly. Lisa woke in a panic, struggling to defend herself, but Sabrina was relentless. The violence was sudden and brutal. Sabrina didn't stop. She didn't pause to think. All of her years of anger, hurt, and frustration poured out in that single, savage act. Lisa fought as best as she could, but she was overpowered. She tried to scream for help, but her voice was silenced by the stabbing pain that racked her body. Sabrina's hands, soaked in blood, continued their ruthless assault. The room became a blur of blood and chaos. In the end, Lisa was left lifeless, a mother whose love had been taken away by the very person she had tried to save. Megan, hearing the sounds of the struggle, rushed into the room to find the unimaginable. Sabrina, standing over her mother's bloodied body, holding the knife like a weapon, her face twisted in shock. The silence in the room was deafening as Megan froze in place, unsure of what to do. Desperate and terrified, Megan grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "Someone's stabbing my mom," she cried, her voice cracking. It was a cry for help that no one would ever forget. The 911 dispatcher's voice cut through the chaos. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm. Police are on their way. Can you tell me what happened?" Megan could barely breathe as she spoke, still in shock from the scene in front of her. Sabrina, Once the quiet and withdrawn girl they had tried to care for was now a stranger, her hands shaking as she held the knife. There was no sign of guilt in her eyes, only confusion and fear, as if she didn't understand what she had just done. The minutes felt like hours as Megan clutched the phone tightly to her ear, her mind racing. I don't know what happened. Sabrina! She killed my mom!" she whispered, too terrified to speak louder. Her voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of every broken piece of her world. Sabrina, still standing there with the knife, began to sob. Her body trembled violently, as though she had just come out of a trance. Her eyes darted around, her breathing erratic. She couldn't look at Megan. She couldn't face what she had just done. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Her thoughts were a jumble, and she didn't know where to begin. It was only then that Sabrina dropped the knife. The sound of it hitting the floor seemed to break the silence, like an unwelcome reality crashing down upon her. She sank to her knees, her sobs echoing through the house, a stark contrast to the violence that had just unfolded. She was both the perpetrator and the victim in her own twisted story. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens blaring down the quiet street as neighbors rushed to their windows. As they stormed into the house, they found Lisa's body and Sabrina in a state of shock, kneeling next to the bed. There was no resistance. Sabrina didn't try to run or hide. She simply let herself be taken into custody. Her once strong and defiant demeanor had been shattered. All that remained was a broken girl who had destroyed everything. The Cannell family's world had crumbled in an instant. Lisa, the heart of the family, was gone. Megan and Haley, forever scarred by the sight of their mother's brutal death, were left to pick up the pieces. Sabrina, their foster daughter, the one they had opened their home to, had turned into a stranger, an enemy they never saw coming. As Sabrina was led away by the officers, she remained silent, her mind too clouded to comprehend what had just happened. What had driven her to this point? What could have made a young girl who had been given a second chance turn on the family that tried to love her? Days passed, but the questions remained. Why did Sabrina snap? What was it about Lisa that pushed her to this breaking point? The investigation into the murder unfolded piece by piece, revealing a dark, hidden side of Sabrina's troubled past. But the answers didn't come easily. Detectives dug into Sabrina's history, trying to understand what had driven her to kill the woman who had given her a home. As they spoke to neighbors, teachers, and social workers, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Sabrina had always been a troubled child. Despite being placed in foster homes and group homes throughout her life, she never managed to find peace. She had been neglected and abused by her biological parents, but that wasn't the full extent of her pain. Sabrina had experienced rejection and abandonment on a level most couldn't comprehend. She had been labeled as a troubled teen, but no one understood the depth of her suffering. She never let anyone close enough to see her wounds, both physical and emotional. Her anger had always simmered just beneath the surface, but it wasn't until she entered the Cannell family's home that it truly began to boil over. Sabrina had begun to feel like she wasn't wanted, like she didn't belong in the Cannell family. Despite all the kindness Lisa and Kevin showed her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was always an outsider. The warmth they had tried to give her only made her feel more alienated. She resented Megan and Haley for their seemingly perfect lives and their bond with their mother. And as time went on, the seeds of jealousy grew into something far darker. Her relationship with Kevin, the father figure who had been kind to her, grew more complicated. Sabrina became obsessed with the idea that Kevin was more than just a father figure to her. She misinterpreted his attention as something more, and that confused longing twisted into a dangerous obsession. It was the perfect storm of emotions, resentment, jealousy, anger, and confusion that led to that fateful night. Sabrina had never been taught how to process these overwhelming emotions. Instead, they built up until they exploded in the most violent way possible. In a twisted way, Sabrina believed that if she could eliminate Lisa, she could finally have the family to herself. She could be the one to get the attention she craved, The love she so desperately wanted could finally be hers. But that night, Sabrina learned the cruel truth. There is no escaping the consequences of violence. There is no way to erase the pain caused by taking someone's life. What Sabrina thought would bring her relief only deepened her suffering. She was forever marked by the horror she had inflicted, both on Lisa and on herself. The trial that followed the murder of Lisa Cannell was a media sensation. Sabrina, now 18, stood before a judge, her once quiet demeanor replaced by the weight of her actions. Her defense team argued that Sabrina was a victim of her past, of years of neglect and abuse that had warped her perception of love and family. They painted her as a broken girl who had snapped under the pressure of a world that had never given her a fair chance. But the prosecution had a different story to tell. They painted Sabrina as a cold-blooded killer who had taken the life of an innocent woman with no remorse. They pointed to the brutality of the murder, the 178 stab wounds, and the fact that Sabrina had not shown any genuine remorse until after the police arrived. They argued that Sabrina's motives were driven not by a deep psychological break, but by selfishness and rage. The trial lasted for weeks, but in the end, Sabrina was found guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to 25 years to life in prison. Her fate was sealed, and there would be no turning back. For Megan and Haley, the road to healing was long and difficult. They had lost their mother, the one person who had always been there for them. They had lost the sense of security they once had in their home. They had lost the idea of family. And although they would eventually find ways to cope, they would never forget the brutal night that shattered everything. As for Sabrina, she sat alone in her cell, her thoughts a constant swirl of guilt and confusion. She had always thought she could run from her past, from the pain that had defined her life. But the truth was, no matter how far she ran, she could never outrun the consequences of her actions. Her life, once filled with hope and possibilities, was now marked by violence and regret. The story of Lisa's death would remain in the minds of everyone who had known her. The town of Willoughby Hills would never be the same again. The peaceful life the Cannell family had once enjoyed was gone, replaced by a dark legacy of loss and unanswered questions. And Sabrina's tragic story would serve as a haunting reminder that sometimes the most unexpected horrors can lurk behind the quietest faces. Months turned into years, and the town of Willoughby Hills struggled to move past the tragedy that had rocked it to its core. For Megan and Haley, the pain of losing their mother never truly went away. They each found their own way to cope, but it was clear that the weight of the past would always be there, quietly following them wherever they went. Megan, who had once been the glue holding her family together, became more withdrawn. The anger and confusion over Sabrina's actions simmered beneath the surface, and though she tried to move forward, every corner of her life seemed haunted by memories of her mother and the girl who had destroyed everything. It wasn't just Sabrina's betrayal that stung, but the loss of the idea of family. The Cannell family had always been close-knit, a unit that supported one another through thick and thin. But now, everything felt fractured. Her once peaceful home had been turned into a symbol of death, violence, and shattered trust. Haley, on the other hand, took a different path. She immersed herself in her studies, pushing herself to succeed at all costs. She found solace in achievement and recognition, hoping that if she could make something of herself, maybe it would be enough to drown out the memories. She stayed active, volunteering and focusing on her education, and in many ways, her life appeared to be back on track. But deep down, Haley was still grappling with the trauma of her mother's death and Sabrina's betrayal. There were days when she'd wake up with the terrifying thought that everything she had worked for was just a distraction from the truth. She was running away from a past she couldn't escape. Then, one night, as Megan was scrolling through her phone, she saw an article in the news, "Sabrina Cannell, up for parole." The headline struck her like a punch to the gut. It had been 6 years since that night. 6 years of Sabrina being locked away in a facility, separated from the world she had once tried to destroy. And now, She was eligible for parole. Megan couldn't believe it. How could anyone think Sabrina deserved another chance? How could the system let someone who had taken her mother's life back into the world? She felt a surge of anger flood her chest. The idea of Sabrina walking free made her sick. Haley, on the other hand, was more contemplative. She wasn't sure how she felt about Sabrina's parole. On one hand, she understood that everyone deserved a second chance, that people could change. But then there was the reality of the violence, the bloodshed, and the permanent scar that Sabrina had left on their lives. Haley wasn't sure if forgiveness was something she could ever offer to the girl who had shattered their family. The night before the parole hearing, Megan couldn't sleep. She kept tossing and turning in bed, her mind racing with memories of her mother, of the house that used to be full of love and laughter, and of the day it all fell apart. She remembered Lisa's warm smile, the sound of her gentle voice, and how she had always been there for her, no matter what. How could Sabrina have done what she did? Why couldn't she see what she had, before it was too late? The morning of the hearing arrived, and Megan, along with Haley, made their way to the courthouse. The place was cold and sterile, filled with the chatter of lawyers, reporters, and families of victims. It was hard for Megan to breathe. She hadn't set foot in a courtroom since the trial all those years ago, and now it felt as though the past was opening up again, ready to swallow her whole. When Sabrina finally walked into the room, Megan couldn't contain the rush of emotions that flooded her. She had heard about Sabrina's transformation in prison, the therapy, the remorse, the newfound understanding of what she had done. But seeing her standing there in front of the parole board, wearing a plain black dress and shackles, was a different reality. Sabrina looked much the same as she had years ago, except now her face seemed more worn, older than her years, as though the weight of the past had aged her beyond recognition. Sabrina's eyes met Megan's, but the connection was fleeting. There was no recognition, no warmth in her gaze, just a hollow emptiness. Sabrina's shoulders slumped, and she looked down at the floor as if she couldn't face the people she had hurt so deeply. The board session began, and Sabrina's defense lawyer spoke first, detailing her progress in prison, the therapy she had undergone, and the remorse she expressed for her actions. The lawyer painted a picture of a girl who had learned from her mistakes, who was now ready to re-enter society as a changed person. Sabrina's voice, when it came, was soft but clear as she addressed the board. "I understand the pain I've caused. I understand that there's no way to make up for what I've done. I can never undo the damage. I killed Lisa, and I've been living with that every single day. I've come to understand how deep the hurt goes, not just for her, but for Megan and Haley." "I can't imagine how you must feel," Sabrina said, her voice trembling. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm only asking for a chance to prove that I can be a better person, a different person." Megan felt her heart harden as Sabrina spoke. She wanted to scream, to tell her that nothing she said would ever change the fact that Lisa was dead. But as much as she hated it, she knew that Sabrina had to be heard. This was the moment when she would be judged, when the decision would be made whether she would walk out of that room and back into the world, or remain behind bars where she belonged. Then it was Megan's turn to speak. She stood up, her hands shaking as she approached the microphone. Her eyes locked on Sabrina's, and the room went quiet. "It's been 6 years since you took my mother from me. 6 years of pain, of nightmares, of wondering why you did what you did. Why my mother? Why our family? You've left a hole in our lives that can never be filled," Megan began, her voice steady but filled with raw emotion. "I don't care if you've changed. I don't care if you've learned to be a better person. You killed my mother, and nothing you say can ever undo that. My family and I will never be the same because of you. I'll never be the same." The room was silent, and Megan felt her words hanging in the air, heavy with the truth she had spoken. She wasn't sure what outcome she wanted. Part of her wanted Sabrina to be locked away forever, to never see the light of day again. But another part of her wondered if there was a path to healing that didn't require vengeance. She wasn't sure. Haley stood next. She spoke softly, but there was power in her words. "I don't believe in forgiveness, Not right now. Maybe one day I will, but not today. What you did to my mom, to our family, it's something that can never be fixed. But I'm also not sure what your future holds. I don't know if I believe in your redemption, but I know one thing. This isn't about me. It's about you, Sabrina. You're the one who has to live with what you've done. The hearing continued, but the tension in the room was palpable. The parole board would deliberate for a while before making their decision, and all Megan could do was sit and wait, knowing that what happened in that room would change everything for Sabrina and for her. It wasn't about justice anymore. It was about something much deeper. In the end, Sabrina's parole was denied. The board cited the severity of the crime and the fact that Sabrina had yet to fully prove that she had changed. There were no winners in that room, only people still living with the consequences of a moment that would never be forgotten. For Megan and Haley, the journey toward healing was just beginning. The past was never truly behind them, but they were starting to understand that the power to move forward was in their hands. Whether Sabrina ever found peace or redemption was no longer their concern. They had their own path to walk, and they were determined to find the strength to do so. The Cannell family had been broken, but somehow they were still standing. Months passed since Sabrina's parole hearing, but life for Megan and Haley never seemed to get any easier. Despite the board's decision to deny Sabrina's release, the shadows of the past lingered over their lives like an unshakable cloud. The pain of losing their mother still held them hostage, leaving them to navigate a world that felt colder and more unforgiving with each passing day. The weight of grief never seemed to lighten. It only grew heavier, a burden they carried with no way of putting it down. Megan, now in her late 20s, tried to build a life that resembled normalcy. She had a job, a modest apartment, and a handful of friends who did their best to support her. Yet every night, in the silence of her own thoughts, she still saw her mother's face, still heard the sound of Sabrina's voice echoing in her mind. The trauma had become a part of her, like an old wound that never quite healed. Haley, too, had tried to move forward, focusing on her studies and excelling in her career. She worked long hours, pouring herself into her job, hoping that success would one day make her feel less broken. But no matter how much she achieved, no matter how many accolades she earned, the emptiness inside her grew. The guilt, the anger, the sorrow, it was all still there, festering, never allowing her to find peace. One fateful evening, Megan received a phone call that would shake her to the very core. The voice on the other end was unrecognizable at first, and it took her a moment to realize who it was. "It's me, Megan. I'm sorry to call you like this." Sabrina's voice cracked through the line. "I just need to tell you something. Something you have to know." Megan felt the blood drain from her face. Sabrina. After all these years, after everything that had happened, Sabrina was calling her. The girl who had destroyed everything, the girl who had torn her family apart, was reaching out. Megan felt the anger flare up inside her immediately. But there was something in Sabrina's voice that made her pause. There was a strange sense of urgency, a desperation that Megan couldn't ignore. "What do you want, Sabrina?" Megan's voice trembled, though she tried to sound calm. I need to confess something," Sabrina continued. "I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I can't carry this anymore. Megan, Sabrina's voice faltered, and Megan's breath caught in her throat. Something was terribly wrong. She could sense it. "What is it? Just tell me," Megan demanded, the anger and fear mixing in her chest. "I never told anyone," Sabrina whispered. "I didn't just kill Lisa. I killed her because of what I found out. I found out things about her, about your family, things I wasn't supposed to know. I wasn't just jealous of her, Megan. I was being manipulated, and But before Sabrina could finish her confession, there was a loud, sharp sound, like something heavy falling. The line went dead. Megan's heart pounded in her chest. She tried calling back, but the number wouldn't go through. Fear gripped her like a vice. She immediately called Haley, telling her what had just happened. They were both terrified, wondering what had just occurred. Why had Sabrina called? What had she meant by her cryptic words? And most disturbingly, what had happened right before the line cut out? They both agreed to go to the facility where Sabrina had been incarcerated to get answers. They arrived in a state of shock, their nerves on edge, uncertain of what they would find. When they entered the visiting room, a guard approached them solemnly, his face grave. "You're here for Sabrina Cannell, right?" the guard asked, his voice low. "Yes. Where is she? What happened?" Megan's voice was sharp with worry. The guard hesitated before speaking. "I'm afraid Sabrina, she's gone. We just found her. It looks like she took her own life." Megan's knees buckled, and Haley's face drained of color. The news hit them like a freight train. They couldn't comprehend it. Sabrina, the girl who had destroyed their family, was now gone, taking her secrets with her. The girl who had caused so much pain had finally chosen to end her own life, leaving nothing behind but more questions and more sorrow. The authorities speculated that Sabrina had struggled with overwhelming guilt, depression, and the trauma of what she had done. They found a note, brief, incoherent, and filled with disjointed thoughts, scrawled in her cell. It didn't offer any explanation, any redemption, only a vague confession of remorse. But it was too late. The damage was done. Sabrina's death had left no real closure, only a deeper, more suffocating sense of loss. Megan and Haley were left standing in the cold, sterile hall of the prison, their emotions running high. They had waited for years for this moment, for some form of justice or reconciliation. But now, all they had was the ghost of a girl who had never truly understood the weight of her actions until it was too late. The drive home was silent. Neither of them knew what to say, how to process the cruel twist of fate that had just unfolded. They had spent so many years trying to heal, trying to move forward, only to be confronted by one last tragedy. The death of the person who had shattered their lives, taking with her all the answers they had longed for. As the days passed, Megan and Haley both realized that there would never be closure. No matter how much time passed, no matter how many years they lived, there would always be a piece of them missing, a hole in their hearts that could never be filled. Sabrina was gone, but the scars she left behind would remain forever. The family that had once been whole would never be the same again. And though they tried to keep moving forward, the shadow of the past was always with them, a constant reminder of the pain and loss that had shaped their lives in ways they could never escape. In the end, Megan and Haley came to understand the cruel truth. There were no answers, no redemption, no healing for them. Their story, their family, had been destroyed long before the final chapter was written, and they would never truly be free